Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, I was approached by a man today. He was wearing robes and held a begging bowl, but he had very stylish hair and rings on his fingers, and several other accompaniments that I have not seen on a monk before.
How can you be so sure that he was a monk?
I suppose I'm not. He said that he was, but he held his bowl by his side, not in front of him so that passerbys might deposit alms into it. He did not sit still in the proper posture for a begging monk. He got up from his seat and came to me. He said he was a monk, but he did not say what monastery he was affiliated with.
If he didn't want food or other offerings, what did he want from you?
There were very few specifics, but he asked me to come with him and join him. When I asked what I was joining, he gave vague answers that made little sense. After politely declining his offer, though I did not even know what it was, he went to somebody else and gave the same odd monologue he had given me.
Truly, he sounds like no monk I have ever heard of. I doubt he's truly affiliated with any of the teachers around here at all. Though he presented himself as a monk, he seems to have only been pretending, given the fancy hair, the jewelry, and the assertive behavior. We should all be cautious against people like him who use the itinerant lifestyle as a costume, like an actor would in a play. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we'll be discussing Buddhist cults. What are some notable Buddhist cults? What do they believe? How can one tell if an organization is a cult or not? We hope you enjoy.
This is a subject where I have a little bit of experience going into it beforehand, unlike most of our other episodes. I was briefly in an actual internet cult that, it was an interesting story. I told it on Into the Abyss a long time ago. If somebody is interested in hearing that part, let me know and I can send you a link. But the basic idea here is that I've also done cult research beforehand. After I was in that cult, I decided that I needed to figure out what had just happened to me. And in doing so, I did some studying. So let's talk about specifically Buddhist cults. So what are some notable Buddhist cults?
This is a very good question because it opens up the discussion of what cults really are and how we ought to view different organizations within Buddhism and also outside of it. The Oxford Dictionary definition of a cult is that it's a system of religious veneration and devotion directed towards a particular figure or object. However, some other dictionary definitions have a much more negative connotation, and you'll also find definitions out there that say that cults are relatively small groups of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as being strange or sinister. Other negative definitions will say that cults are a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing. However, by these definitions, all monotheistic religions would count as cults. Christianity would be the cult of Jesus. Islam would be the cult of Muhammad, etc. So clearly this definition of cult is incomplete because it's capturing the three largest religions in the world. In the popular imagination, when people say the word cult, especially in the West, we may think of Scientology, the Davidians of Waco, Texas, or the Jonestown cult. If these are what come to mind in the popular imagination of the word, then we can also glean that cults have to be a religious minority. They must be deviant in their practice, and they must utilize tools such as alienation of the individual from the group, thought control, and various forms of psychological, physical, and financial violence. Whether or not to apply those characteristics to the definition of cults as a whole is an interesting debate. One reason for that is that those cults I mentioned earlier that are so well known in the popular imagination are some of the only ones that make the news or have documentaries made about them because of their violence, deviance, and radicalism. That means that there are tons of cults out there right now which are much less harmful than those. For those cults, such a negative definition as I offered may not apply. That means that there is a spectrum of definitions of cults, ranging from the broad and general one that regards them as just being small groups that worship something or someone, all the way to the specific and negative one that applies more specifically to cults like Scientology, Davidians, and Jonestown. I have my own personal opinion that falls somewhere on that spectrum, but for the purposes of this episode, I'm going to highlight some Buddhist cults that fall into the more specific and negative connotation, particularly because the line between a cult and a sect is very fuzzy. Some of the notable cults that I want to bring to the conversation today are Aum Shinrikyo, Rigpa International, and Happy Science. I'm more familiar with the Japanese Buddhist cults, as that is my field of study. So if you are aware of any other notable cults that come from other places and are affiliated nominally, or at least they claim they're affiliated with Buddhism, please let us know on Twitter or over email.
This definition of cult is a really hard one to nail down, to the point where a lot of cult researchers, people who actually report and study these cults, don't use the word cult themselves. They might use totalitarian group, they might use new religious movement, but there's a lot of contention with the word cult. I'll also add that cults don't necessarily need to be religious. There are cults out there around exercise routines. There are cults out there around Hollywood personalities. There are cults out there, like any multi-level marketing scheme is going to have a cultish element to it as well. The definition of cult is so broad and so flexible that even this idea of religion is not a required part of it. But for the purposes of this episode, we're going to focus on religion because we're talking about Buddhist cults specifically. So let's talk about some of the ones we've already mentioned here. So what do these cults believe?
So we have discussed Aum Shinrikyo before. This is the Japanese new religious movement that fomented the 1995 sarin gas attacks on the Tokyo metro lines. Their leader, Shoko Asahara, co-opted doctrines and ideas from several religions, including Buddhism, to feed into an apocalyptic cult that, as I mentioned, did those nerve gas attacks on the Tokyo Metro subway in 1995. We discussed them in the context of the idea of Powa for that previous episode, but they also called upon doctrines like karma in their belief system. In addition to that, they also called on Christian ideas like rapture, which they actually tried to cause with their attacks. Their mode of operation was very similar to other cults and other new religious movements all across the world. In the 1990s, Japan was entering an economic slump after a big, large economic boom that had lasted up through the 1980s. Aum Shinrikyo would target and prey upon young men who are depressed and disenfranchised with the materialism, the economic uncertainty, and the overall existential malaise of Japanese society in the early 1990s. Shoko Asahara is now in prison for his role in those gas attacks. The second cult that we mentioned, Docs also has some first-hand experience with. Rigpa International is a Tibetan Buddhist cult that was founded in 1979 by Sogyal Rinpoche. Sogyal Rinpoche is nominally the author, even though it was ghostwritten, of the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. The organization is a network of over 100 Buddhist centers in 23 different countries. In 2017, after allegations of sexual and physical abuse, Rigpa commissioned an external investigation and found those claims to be substantiated, but Sogyal Rinpoche continually denied that he ever had any connection to the assault or the abuse. He passed away in 2019. The organization engages directly with Tibetan Buddhist doctrine and with Bon doctrine. Bon is a syncretic religion between Buddhism and Tibetan indigenous religions. Sogyal Rinpoche was regarded widely by the Tibetan Buddhist ecumenical structure to be the reincarnation of Turton Sogyal Lerab Lingpa, who was a visionary and a teacher of the 13th Dalai Lama in the 19th century. That makes classifying Rigpa International very difficult, because it does actually have an ecumenically confirmed and validated connection. And at the same time, Tibetan Buddhism and Bon are both very complicated religions that interact with larger veins of Buddhism in very interesting ways. And so to understand Rigpa International as a cult only happens in understanding the sexual assault and abuse and the physical assault and abuse that went on under Sogyal Rinpoche's tenure as the leader of this organization. Do you want to talk a little bit about your engagement with the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying?
Sure. Before I do that, I want to circle back on something we were talking about with Shinrikyo. So, the way they targeted young men who are disenfranchised is an extremely common element in cult stories. It was also in mine. It is called situational vulnerability, and it basically refers to anybody who is in a circumstance that makes them more emotionally vulnerable. In my case, it was due to disability and chronic illness and losing my career. Other people, it can be losing a parent, it can be the end of a marriage, it can be all kinds of things, the end of a career. This is just something that a lot of cults do, is prey upon vulnerable people. As for Rigpa International, once upon a time I mentioned that I was interested in Buddhism to a therapist of mine, and she actually loaned me the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and I read through most of it. It was an interesting read, I enjoyed reading it, but then I looked up the author and found out about that. My therapist was heartbroken when I told her that the dude was an asshole. The reports I saw talked about sexual abuse, and also he was eating steaks and expensive food every day. He was living like a king, in spite of, that's not how Buddhism's supposed to work. So, yeah, these cults can get at you in insidious ways. And if you don't look for it, you can very easily be suckered into drinking from a poisoned well, like the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying.
And I think that this represents what is so important about someone's approach to a religion or a system of belief or some sort of iteration of spirituality, such as Buddhism. That is such a vital moment because it can cause that same situational vulnerability that we were talking about before. Anything that causes somebody to search for the meaning behind all of the random crap that happens to us in our daily lives, they are easily swayed into any number of different pathways that could lead to destruction. Some of them could lead to higher awakening. Some of them could lead to great happiness and contentedness and peace. But others can certainly lead into these cult organizations, because these cult organizations are often trying to be at the front of the line whenever you are in one of these moments where you're trying to search for meaning. And they are very quick and very enthusiastic about giving you that meaning. And that meaning then consumes your life by design of these cults. And that's something that you have to be very careful of. That's something you have to watch out for. Moving on to the last cult that I mentioned, Happy Science. This one might seem a little bit comical, actually, as I tell you about the definitions of it. Happy Science, or in Japanese, Kofuku no Kagaku, is a Japanese new religious movement that was founded in 1986 by Ryoho Okawa. This movement has earned the designation of cult because Ryoho Okawa is regarded as being the current incarnation of El Cantare. El Cantare is a deity who, according to Happy Science, has been reincarnating on Earth for 330 million years and has been worshipped in various forms, including Shakyamuni Buddha, Odin, Hermes, Osiris, Thoth, and others. This cult is also a conservative political organization with some standing elected officials. In Japan, they have a multi-party system based on, I think, ranked voting. And so in that regard, there are dozens of different parties in Japanese government. And even though some parties are very small, such as the Happy Science political organization, they are still there, and they still very much believe Happy Science. It's very concerning. In order to join this organization, one must believe in angels, demons, heaven, hell, reincarnation, and aliens. Those are the barrier of entry. What is particularly important about this organization that is sort of darkly hilarious is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, this group got in trouble for selling spiritual vaccines to its members. So you could, as a member of Happy Science, you could pay the organization and they would send you video lectures given by Ryoho Okawa, just preaching about whatever. And the idea was that this would then protect you from pathogens. It would protect society and the world from destruction caused by a pathogen. Wild stuff. Ryoho Okawa's son, Hiroshi Okawa, has left the cult and regularly denounces the cult as being absolutely crazy, completely out there, complete nonsense. And this is actually pretty dramatic in terms of Japanese news lately, because he was regarded actually as the spiritual successor to Ryuho Okawa upon his death. So that being the case, it's very, very interesting and very good that Hiroshi Okawa has left and started denouncing all of their doctrines and trying to distance himself from it, because this is actually quite a dangerous organization, if indeed there are people who believe in these spiritual vaccines.
This idea of mixing together different religions and different sources of doctrine is pretty common in cults as well. Cults will basically draw from everything they can to make themselves sound more legit than they are. So I've seen cults talking about, reincarnations of multiple gods. Like it happens, and it's a very easy warning sign to keep an eye out for.
As we'll see whenever we discuss the next point, usually the cult doctrines are set by the cult leader. And what those doctrines end up being is just the idiosyncratic, personal, peculiar beliefs of that leader who he is trying to enforce as doctrine, enforce as the law.
Yeah, cults are often defined by their leaders. So let's talk a bit about something more practical for a potential listener. So how can one tell if an organization is a cult or not?
So given everything that we've said so far, I would like to emphasize that we are not experts. We are just enthusiasts, and we study these things on the sidelines. It's not our primary place of expertise. So we would like to defer to the experts. We've linked in the show notes a website called cultescape.com, which offers all of the necessary steps and procedures and all of the information that one might need in order to figure out if they are in a cult, and if so, how to get out of it, with links to counselors in the United States. So if you think that you might be involved with a cult, they have a nice test which allows you to measure how much of a cult this organization is, and then, of course, they provide exit counseling or some sort of de-assimilation procedures and materials. In Buddhism, in my opinion, it's easier to spot a cult than it is in other religions. There are some shared characteristics among all the cults that we have talked about today that make them stick out. Here are just a few of them. If you're in a group which the leader is always right about doctrine, about ritual practice, about what is the best way to view the world, etc., and they simply cannot ever be wrong, if their word is law, you might be dealing with a cult. In Buddhism, the only dharma out there is the Buddha Dharma. If someone is preaching something to you which is not that, but they are calling it Buddhism, they are calling it that, you might be in a cult. I will concede that in some cases it's contentious whether or not something that you're looking at is actually the Buddha Vachana, or the words of the Buddha. He obviously did not write anything down, nor did his first generation of disciples. So there's a little bit of the telephone game going on with the texts. Additionally, there are some apocryphal texts which were written in the Buddha's voice for political reasons, but those instances point straight at the phenomenon I'm talking about. If what is being preached to you is somebody's own personal idiosyncratic belief system, then you are likely dealing with a cult. If the members of the cult use tools like charisma, false promises, threats, or violence of any kind, be it psychological, physical, extortionate, etc., to bring or keep somebody into the fold, then you might be dealing with a cult. Very few Buddhists are concerned with converting people or proselytizing. And even the ones that are simply try to present you the doctrines and leave the rest up to you, rather than trying really hard to make you leave the groups you are already a part of and the relationships you already have in order to come join their fold. They will not be aggressive or pushy, nor will they act like used car salesmen, nor do they threaten or lie. Those directly violate the precepts that Buddhists are expected to follow, and therefore you'll not see it happen. If you do, you're likely dealing with a cult. If they don't seem overly concerned with doctrinal texts like sutras, but are instead concerned with texts authored by the cult leader or no text at all, the organization might be a cult. Buddhism, as I've said before, is a religion of texts, and you can use an organization's engagement with the text as a foolproof barometer of measuring whether or not they are a Buddhist cult. All of the cults that we have mentioned today do not spend the majority of their time engaging with the sutras, either by copying them, reciting them, lecturing on them, etc. Instead, they spend their time engaging with texts or lectures authored by the leader of the organization, and that is if they spend any time engaging with texts at all. If their doctrines or rituals are somehow deviant from the Buddhist mainstream, then the organization may be a cult. The cults that we've mentioned engage in ritual suicide, online proselytization, terrorism, or other types of activities that are not recitation or copying of the texts. They are not merit transfer rituals, they are not meditation, and they're not other common Buddhist practices that we've discussed on this show. Buddhists will pretty much never try to convert you online. They will never hold a doctrine that is contrary to some of the important doctrinal points that we've discussed on this show, like emptiness or impermanence. Like we said last week, if you think that some organization that you're dealing with might be a cult and you would like a second or third opinion, feel free to ask us and we'll offer our 2 cents. We are not the experts on all Buddhist cults, but we have both encountered and studied them in our past, and we might be able to offer a fresh perspective. Just reach out over email, Twitter, or Discord, and we'll be happy to help.
Don't feel too bad if you're not sure. It took me months to realize that the organization I had joined before was a cult. It can sneak up on you. So if you're not sure, that's okay. Ask for help. People will be able to help you with that. And make sure to ask somebody outside of the organization.
That's probably the most important part. These cults function by alienating the individual from the group, and if you are unsure, then one way to test is try and engage back with a group that is not the cult. Try and reach out to relationships that you had before engaging with whatever you're engaging with. And if that's okay, if the cult or the group that you're part of looks down upon you for that, tries to stop that, tries to get in the way of that, or if they support it and they're into it and they don't even think about it or mention it, that might be a good measure of what kind of group you're dealing with.
Everything that was just mentioned is also probably the best way to get out of a cult if you find yourself in one. Reach out to people that you knew before you joined the cult and try to reconnect with them. That is how people get out of the more controlling cults.
And absolutely do not ever feel guilty if you have been preyed upon by one. It happens to the best of us. It happens to people who are very smart. It happens to people who have great situational awareness. It happens to people who have super sharp critical thinking skills. This kind of thing is designed to get around all of those things. And so don't feel guilty if it has gotten around those things in you and you feel like you have to de-assimilate yourself.
We hope you have enjoyed this week's episode about Buddhist cults. Join us next week where we will discuss koans. What are they? What is the doctrine behind them? How are they used? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
See you next time. Thank you for listening.
Instead of our usual outro.
So we would like to take just a second to address whatever of the many shootings we have dealt with this past week. It's driving us insane, waking up every morning to a headline that some other mass shooting has happened in the United States. We would like to say fuck guns, fuck white supremacy, and fuck politicians who refuse to do anything about guns and white supremacy.
And also fuck cops.
And fuck cops for being cowards and not running into the schools to save children, or only running into the schools to save their own children. And also fuck cops for macing and pepper spraying parents who were trying to tell the cops to go in and save their dying children. This is what most of our local politics, state politics, and federal politics budgets are going towards. Coward cops who are not worth anything.